Kia ora tātou. Harikoa ahau ki te kite e a koutou e tēnei pō. Nau mai, haere mai. Ko Hiriranaka, te whenua o oku tupuna. Ko Hiriranaka, te wāhi I whānau mai ai o. Ko te awa tupua, te awa taku tamarikitanga. Ko whanganui, te wāhi I te pou ake I au. Ko whanganui collegiate, te kura I ako ai au. Ko Gunasekara, te ingoa o toku whānau. Ko Neville, toku mātua. Ko Telina, toku whaia. Ko te ture tako kainga kau ko Gehan. Aho. Okay, what can I say after the introduction you gave me, Carla? That was very deeply moving and humbling. I'm very deeply grateful to you. And I know that getting to be appointed professor at the University of Auckland is a somewhat daunting task, and wouldn't really have been possible without some very nice things being said about you by your dean. So I'm very deeply appreciative of that. But apart from that, I've always sensed sensed from you, Carla, a deep empathy, a warmth, aroha, which I think we have all experienced, and I think we're just very lucky to have you as our dean. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. Aroha nui, that's very, very kind. Okay, so without, if anyone expected a deep erudite lecture on privacy law tonight, you're going to be disappointed. But I thought I'd better say a few interesting things about privacy, otherwise it would be misleading and deceptive. And my colleagues will be, litigating me on that. So if we can, I thought we'll make a start by looking at what privacy actually is. And the old-fashioned attitude was to say it's about identifying someone. Somebody knows you're Gehan or John Smith or Mary Bloggs. But I think privacy has moved off that, and privacy is more about exploiting some aspect of your personality, which they don't even need to know your name or even to identify you. And I think that is the top title of my talk. Is it really personal, or is it something else? And that really gets to the bottom of what I think privacy is evolving into. So I also wanted to think about the seduction of technology. Every week, every month, there is some new, glitzy new platform or technology. Now, the latest topic is AI, of course. But before AI, there was something else. There's always some technological wave that is about to hit us. And this is the seduction. And we're told that we need this. And this is the new thing. And hey, go along with it. Don't try and resist it. Just embrace it. The seduction is there. So the question I ask is, are we being softened up? Because once we accept that, then the next stage might be something a little bit more intrusive. Something might be a little bit more intrusive, but because we've already been softened up, we say, okay, well, we can't do anything about it now. That's the world we live in. So consider, for example, interactive facial detection for marketing. Now, some of my colleagues here may be marketers, so apologies to you. I have nothing against marketing. But the latest trend of marketing is to actually engage directly with people through technology. And this little clip that I'm going to show you is not new. This is actually quite an old clip. Technologies like this have been in use in New Zealand now for quite some time. The software behind it has been used in New Zealand for quite some time already. You might have noticed it in Westfield shopping malls and places. If you stand next to the billboards, they'll flash a billboard that is aimed at you. So they know your age, they know a whole lot of things about you. But they don't know you are necessarily that you're John Smith. Or at least they say they don't in their privacy policy, okay? They have the capability, clearly, if they wanted to, they could have facial recognition. But I accept the statement that they don't need to know that because they are getting something else from you. So let's have a quick look at this, if we can just click on that. Yeah, so you get the idea. So the question is, they're not necessarily finding out your identity, but they can detect a lot of things about you. And the kind of things they can apply that technology for are age. They can tell somebody's age right away to a remarkable degree of accuracy. Now, age verification is, in fact, a serious issue now, as the UK, we hear, has banned social media for under 16s. So and the onus is put on the companies to then say how old somebody is. So these kind of technologies clearly have application. But they have more sinister applications. They could be used by your employer to see if you're happy at work. Are you engaged? You can see where this is going to end up, right? So that's, once we've been softened up, where does this end? And then, of course, there's facial recognition technology, such as is used by foodstuffs in the supermarkets and so on. Detecting physiological and cognitive disorders that can be used in medical applications. So these technologies are incredibly accurate at being able to detect how somebody behaves as to whether they have some condition. They can also, it's not just a face, it's also how somebody walks. So your gait, for example, can instantly disclose the fact that you've got some kind of cognitive disorder. So these are all more intrusive technologies, and where do we draw the line? So the question is, where do we draw a line and say, hang on, that needs some special rules? So once we go down this track, it's very difficult to stop it. Okay, so that's just a teaser to start off with. But this is more about where I got to this point. It's meant to be a bit of a story. And thank you. I wanted to also thank Carla, but also the many of you who have turned out here, including many alumni, former summer scholars, many of you very distinguished summer scholars who I will mention in the course of this talk, some of you, so you're going to get a bit of a surprise. But also there are many privacy experts in the room. So those of you who know a little bit about the privacy will know there's a section in the Privacy Act, Section 27, which allows people an immunity, or allows them a safe harbor for sharing and disclosing information for their personal and domestic affairs. Okay, I'm going to give that shelter the widest possible interpretation. Okay, so if those of you fall into that definition, unless, because insufficient bribes were received for non-disclosure. So there's going to be a bit of that. Anyway, let's go back to the beginning. This is meant to be a bit of an origin story, so I believe that's the traditional format. So, I'm a child of the tropics. Okay, I was born actually not far from the equator. I was born literally within a few hundred kilometers of the equator in Colombo, which was then the capital of a country that was then called Ceylon. While I was still at primary school, the country then changed its name to Sri Lanka. So that was where I grew up, in Colombo, the capital city. And I guess I must have been a cute baby to start off with. So you can see where my obsession with cars comes, that's... although I may have been cute, but as I grew up, clearly I could show attitude, and apparently I was also quite naughty and mischievous. So, but clearly it looked like I must have been predestined to be an academic. So I was obviously destined for that. Okay, now my parents, Neville and Talia, who are here tonight. They grew up under British colonial rule, and they were born under British colonial rule, grew up under colonial rule, and they were so well colonized that English was our first language at home. Okay, we were bilingual, obviously, we could speak Sinhalese, but at home, the middle class at that time, the English-educated middle class spoke English at home. Okay, that's how well colonized they were. Now, my dad, his family comes from Galle. If you follow cricket, you'll know where that is, Galle on the west coast of Sri Lanka. And even though both our families on both sides are Protestant Christians, my grandfather, who was a Methodist, chose to send my dad to what I guess must have been the leading secondary school at the time in Galle, St. Aloysius College, which is a Catholic institution. And they tried very hard, according to Dad, to convert him to Catholicism. Instead, he became a Marxist. Okay, so it didn't work. But I learned a lot of things from Dad. He was one of the things he taught me early on was that to understand a political point of view, you had to actually understand both sides. So it's no good just having your own perspective. You need to understand the other side and see it from their perspective completely in order to be able to address their arguments. Otherwise, you're wasting your time, because if you can't relate to that other argument. And the other thing Dad taught me early on was that it was very important to be able to write things down. So if you had some thought or an argument or a point you wanted to make, it was very important to actually put it in writing, because otherwise, it's no point talking about it. Can you express that clearly? And that has actually been one of the most useful lessons that I learned early on. Now, my dad went on to be a public servant. He worked for the Port of Colombo. Before that, he was with the Inland Revenue Department. He was a unionist. But after coming to New Zealand, he worked for a short while in the banking industry, and then he took a retirement, and he supported my mother's career by being the main carer at home, because my mother's career then, by that stage in New Zealand, took up a lot of her time. Now, my mum was a graduate. About the time my parents were married, she graduated as a medical doctor from Colombo University, and she went on to specialize in anesthesia, became a consultant specialist. She studied in the UK. The Sri Lankan government gave her a scholarship to go and study in the UK, where she completed, after several years, her fellowship. She's a fellow of the College of Anesthesia in the Royal College of Surgeons, and now, of course, she is also a fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Anaesthetists. So she has had a distinguished medical career. Mum was disappointed, I think, that I never took after her and following her into medicine. There was one small problem with that, with her plan to get me into medicine. If I see even just a drop of blood, okay, so that was never going to work. Okay, this is the house I grew up in Sri Lanka. It's still there. I took a picture in 2018 when I visited. I don't know who owns the house now, but I took a picture from the outside. It looks exactly the same. The corner room was mine, so I was in the corner room. I had windows facing on both sides, coconut trees in the garden. It was a beautiful, idyllic, tropical kind of growing up. And I was a free-range kid. I had a bicycle. I roamed the entire housing development on my bike. You know, I was given free rein as long as I didn't go onto the main road. So I knew all the other kids in the neighborhood. I had happy memories of growing up in that house. However, you'll see that after we left Sri Lanka, I think the agonies that that country has experienced, most of which happened after we left the country, are kind of reflected in the boundary wall, if you look at it. So when I was a kid growing up, that was where the wall was, down there. And as a 10-year-old, I could easily scale that. But now it's looking like a bit of a fortress, you know. So that must have happened after we left. Now, the house was also very unusual in the sense that it had a fish pond inside the living room. So it was an architect-designed house, a beautiful house. People used to marvel at it. There was a fountain, and quite often I'd fall into the pond and get into trouble. But you know, I have happy memories of growing up there. So these aren't necessarily in sequence. So I have a slightly older sister. I have a younger brother who's here tonight, who is 9 years younger to me. And this picture was taken not long after we moved to New Zealand. And Granddad moved with us a few years after we moved. He also came to New Zealand and lived with us for a few years. Obviously, he's not with us anymore, but he was a surveyor by profession. He was also a very talented artist. He did landscape and portrait paintings, many of which now grace our homes. So Granddad was quite a talented painter and a portrait and landscape painter especially. Okay. Growing up in Sri Lanka, I initially attended St. Thomas's Preparatory School, an Anglican school for boys. Again, this is a picture I took when I visited in 2018. Looked exactly the same. School had not changed. The only thing that's different is all the high-rise buildings that are now around it. But it's bordered on the one side with the Indian Ocean. Beautiful, tropical kind of place. The windows were wide open and the wind would blow through. When I was 6 years old, my dad traveled to be with my dad for 6 months in London, in the UK. So that was a formative period for me as a 6-year-old. That's me feeding the pigeons in Trafalgar Square. While there, Dad also wrote a report for the Sri Lankan government on the benefits of containerization, and I believe that actually led to the Sri Lankan government deciding to adopt the containerization of the port. So that was influential. Now, in that year, so between was it spring and summer of 1969, a significant year. Does anyone know what significant event happened in July of that year? Yeah, that was the Apollo 11, right? So Sri Lanka didn't have TV, but luckily in the UK, my dad bought a small black and white TV set, and I sat for 5 days glued to this TV set. It was holidays, and yeah, it was pretty amazing. Did they go? Right? But well, I don't know, but at the same time I was watching Doctor Who and Thunderbirds. Thunderbirds was on as well, so it was all fun. But I have vivid memories of that. It was almost like it happened yesterday. I can still remember the voice of the BBC commentators. Now, while I was in London, I went to a school for a short time, a multicultural North London school. Colleagues who are here today will know that I have an unfortunate habit of falling asleep during meetings. Clearly, this habit started quite early. So, yeah, it must have started around that time. Okay, but all good things come to an end. We had to go back to Sri Lanka after my mum completed her training. Now, Sri Lanka, unfortunately, was changing. At that time, this lady was elected as Prime Minister for her second term. So her first term was, in fact, before I was born. She had the distinction, this is Sirimawa Bandaranaike, who was the world's first female Prime Minister when she was elected in her first term. But during this second term was about the time we came back from England. And the country, she adopted a policy of extreme austerity where no imports were allowed into the country. And the basic principle was what you could buy, what you had, was what the country could only produce. And this was painful, where my parents had to queue for bread, they had to queue for milk powder, rice, so there was rationing, there was genuine hardship during that time. On the other hand, that government did do some good things. They nationalized the tea industry, which in time led to the likes of Dilmah. Okay, so we have Dilmah today and all these other. Our tea is a lot fresher as a result, because it's now packed in Sri Lanka fresh right after it comes out of the factories. In those days, before the nationalization, it was shipped off to England, repackaged, blended, and then exported around the world. Of course, it loses its freshness when that happens. So there were some good things that came out of that government, but painful, and in my case, literally painful, because I had to have some teeth extracted. I was having some dental work done for my orthodontic treatment was just beginning, and the country had run out of local anesthetic. So I had to have 2 teeth pulled out. Yeah, you kind of remember these things as a kid. It was painful, yeah. Yeah, so the decision was made, painful decision was made. My mum had a good job. She was a senior anaesthetist at the neurosurgical unit in Colombo, which was an elite medical institution, but she gave that up to move to New Zealand, to Whanganui, to take up a role as an anaesthetist in a small provincial hospital. And New Zealand was desperately short of medical personnel then, as it is again now. So nothing much has changed. So then we came to Aotearoa, and by one of those strange kind of ironies, we settled in Whanganui, the banks of the Te Awatupu, or the Wanganui River, which just after we moved there, the government built New Zealand's first data centre, the Wanganui Computer Centre. So it's one of those strange ironies that as a 12-year-old, I watched this building being built. I literally cycled around it. I saw it coming up, wondered what it was, okay, little knowing that I would, in the end, and of course New Zealand had its very first privacy commissioner, was appointed to handle the sensitive law enforcement data that was stored in that building. Of course, it was all concentrated. So there was data sovereignty was not a problem because all the government data was in that building, literally, which I guess is a bit risky, but that was. But it was a super strong building. It was earthquake proof. It was, somebody tried to blow it up in 1980, and they only ended up scratching the glass. So yeah. Okay. So growing up, my parents decided to send me to. By the way, in those days it was called Wanganui, not Whanganui. There was no H. And I still refer to it as Wanganui because I've been reliably informed that the local iwi don't pronounce the H. So Hone, that's and by the way, Hone, thank you very much for your very kind introduction at the start, which you translated for us. I'm humbled by that as well. But the local iwi apparently don't pronounce the H. So if I every now and then forget to pronounce the H, it doesn't really matter because that's what they say in my hometown. But I went to Wanganui Collegiate, and at that time it was a private Anglican school, 500 boys, mostly boarders, but I was a day boy. There was one Chinese boy, one Maori boy, and me. I was the only first person of color from South Asia to go to the school. So 3 of us in a school of 500 boys. So it was very, very monocultural. There were some great teachers. I have very great, teachers taught me to stand up for what I believed. They were very good. But it was a rough and tumble, right? Everyone had to play rugby in the 3rd form. And then I discovered to my horror that they still had cadets, military cadets. So we were sent off to boot camp in the middle of winter to a terrible windswept location. We were in tents. 6 in the morning, they would blow a whistle. You had to go for a 5-mile run down the beach, after which you were given a hosing down with a cold hose. It was torture. The assault course almost killed me. I thought there's no way I could survive another time of this. So then I discovered, before I got to the 4th form, that if you joined the school band, you didn't have to go to this terrible boot camp. You'd be sent to a band camp instead, where you'd have, you'd practice your instruments. So I said, sign me up. There's no. So there I was in the school band, and it so happened that our family were musical. So we had a kind of a family band at the same time. My dad it was his hobby. He had a band. He had a band in Sri Lanka too, a dance band. So we had our own little music group in Whanganui, which still performs from time to time. We still have the jam sessions. So that music kept us, grounded, and it kept me sane and allowed me something. And later on, of course, Collegiate encouraged that, and we were kind of trailblazers at Collegiate at that time. There were other boys too who were starting to sort of get into the arts and cultural rather than just rugby, because at that time, obviously, I didn't have the physique to be in the first 15, so that was never going to be a go. So so that's Collegiate, and then in my 7th form year, I managed to scoop up that raised a few eyebrows, because there I was, the first person from South Asia. And I scooped up all the senior academic prizes: history, chemistry, English, and the best one of all was the Christie Rose Bowl essay for the best Christie Rose Bowl trophy for the best essay. So I guess that was my first publication. It was published the following year in the school magazine, and everyone said, "Who's the Sri Lankan who's writing? Who's getting the English prize?" But anyway, that was kind of so my parents kind of were pleased about that. But sadly, by this stage, my Sinhalese had gone completely, so I was monolingual by this stage. My Sinhalese I was no longer bilingual, so that came at a price. Okay, well, as the years went by in New Zealand, we really settled into the lifestyle. It's a family. We embraced the lifestyle. Summer holidays on the beach. One of the few activities I really like doing is sailing. It's very relaxing, and it's an activity. It's the only outdoor activity that I really found quite, I got a lot of pleasure from that. So after a while, obviously we realized we were proud of our Sri Lankan heritage, and a country with 2,500 years of written history, one of the world's oldest civilizations, but that was no longer home. Okay, home was now here. Aotearoa was my home. That's where I staked my future. And I guess nowadays the world is more complicated. People have multiple identities. We have people, with many citizenships, and it's not that clear. But in my case, it was clear. There was no going back. It was this is home now, not Sri Lanka. So I settled into this new lifestyle. But a lot of things were happening at this time. So around this time in New Zealand, we were entering into a tumultuous period. In 1981, I was in my senior year at Wanganui Collegiate, and it was the Springbok Tour. It divided the country right down the middle. But in places like Wanganui, it was a rugby-mad town, right? So the protest movement was not really welcome. I was drawn into the protest movement through the various church groups I was involved with. It was a very muscular kind of Christianity, not a kind of, well, it encouraged passive disobedience. It was a kind of Christianity that was not concerned about saving people's souls for the next world. It was about saving people in this world, right? So Nelson Mandela was still in jail. South Africa was still under apartheid rule, and New Zealanders turned out in the thousands to oppose the tour. So things came to a head when the headmaster gave the school the afternoon off to go and watch the game at Spriggans Park in Wanganui. And however, I didn't go and watch the game. I joined you can imagine 500 boys, one boy protested, and you can guess who that was. So then the die was cast, right? Activism. I started, the activism kind of got into my blood. I used to visit, slide aside here, I used to visit Sir Bruce Slane, the late Sir Bruce Slane, New Zealand's first privacy commissioner, who had a very close relationship to this university and did many guest lectures for us. But I used to visit him very close to the end of his life. He was in a nursing home that was 5 minutes from our house. So I used to visit him regularly towards the end. And he was physically very, very weak, but mentally incredibly sharp. I hope his spirit is with us, because he was very sharp. He followed everything that was going on, and he even told me, useful bits of information that I hadn't picked up. He would read everything. He would keep on top of everything. And on one of my last visits to him, he said, it was about the time we launched the Privacy Foundation, but he said to me, Gehan, he said, I don't know how you get away with it. Some of the stuff you write, you're in a business school. How do you get away with that? Well, clearly I have got away with it, because I'm standing here today. But lots of support from Sir Bruce. So I'm very, very grateful to him for that. But activism started back in '81. And then, of course, there was the anti-nuclear movement, which I was involved with. Now, the point to make here is that these movements didn't just happen, right? New Zealand didn't suddenly decide to become nuclear free. There were tens of thousands of people who joined and pushed this. And I was just a foot soldier. I was not a leader. I was just a foot soldier amongst tens of thousands of others. So the lesson I learned there is, unless people support these movements, they're not going to succeed. And we did succeed. I managed to see New Zealand, the legislation passed. And I suddenly began to realize at that point that the law is important, because it's about the law and how the law is worded. At that time, I became a law student. So had to go to university. And by the way, this is what I looked like in those years. Kind of fit the bill. Victoria University beckoned because it was close to Wanganui, and it was the nearest connection to a tertiary institution. And I wanted to study history initially. And in fact, I did what we'd now call a conjoint. I did a BA in majoring in history and an LLB. And I enjoyed history so much that they offered me a ticket into their honors program with a view to doing a PhD. They said, look, you're suited for that. You should be a history scholar. And so I went to my parents, and they might remember this conversation. And I said, I really want to give up law. It's not something I really want to do history. That's what. And they said, well, what would you do after that? I said, well, I'll do a PhD. And they said, then what? And they just said, well, you just end up as an academic. It's a dead-end career. So there we are. So, but by this stage, by this stage, I was starting to get interested in the law anyway, because I could suddenly see that, the way bills were worded and laws were made actually made a difference. And, the anti-nuclear legislation was a case in point. So one thing led to another. And so at this time, I was also doing a lot of traveling. And thanks to Mum, because Mum would often take me for anesthetic conferences overseas, and because Dad had to stay behind to look after my brother. So I became like her companion that would go with her to these conferences. And I got to go to lots of places, and California and, Europe. What's wrong with that picture? It's not AI generated. Okay, we did some crazy stuff, but, there I was. Went to the States, traveled in the States as well. So we went to Europe, the States, and while I was in the States, I met this girl, Aruni, right? Bumped into her, and our paths crossed. And the following year, I invited her to come to New Zealand in the summer. She's never forgiven me for that, because she says that I told her it was a tropical paradise. I never said any such thing. But it was a good summer. So that, when she came, it was a good summer, thankfully. The weather was decent. So anyway, she traveled. We traveled around New Zealand, and so long-distance relationship ensued. In those days, no internet, no email. So you had to write letters and wait for 2 weeks for the letter to come back. And this went on for a while. And then the following year, we ended up getting married in Portland, Oregon, in the States. So very grateful to Aruni because, first of all, moving to New Zealand. Secondly, she's a graduate of the University of Portland. She graduated in communications. So she's, that's her major. She could have been a journalist. She could have gone into PR. But after coming to New Zealand, she decided no, she would just do administrative jobs. And after the second of our children were born, she became a full-time carer. And she was really the rock of the family in terms of supporting the home front. Eventually, once the kids went to school, she did go back to administration in part-time roles. So that meant that I didn't have to worry about the school. Our kids never went to daycare. Not for one day in their life. So she was always there to do the school pickup. So as a result of that, I think I benefited from that. I did the fun stuff though. So when I got home, the homework was done. You see, when I got home, the homework was done. The kids were all changed and fed and everything. So it was great. But I occasionally helped, with school projects and things. And I got to do the fun stuff. I went on school trips, right? Because academia allows you that flexibility. And when I was able to, I took them on school trips. Memorable school trips. I remember one school trip to the zoo, Auckland Zoo, where a teacher put me in charge of five-year-old boys who then all took off in different directions, right? And I was trying to think how I'd explain to little Johnny's parents, why I allowed him to climb into the lion enclosure. But luckily it ended happily. So we had a lot of fun times. But thanks to Aruni, she held the home front together, provided that stability which allowed me to make the most of my academic career. So a turning point was reached in when I graduated, got admitted to the bar. I sent out my CV. I got job offers from law firms. I clerked in law firms, so I had some experience of what law was. And it was interesting. I found some of the work quite interesting. But the straw that broke the camel's back was I had a very good mentor in the Crown Solicitor in Wanganui at that time. And he got me to put all the documents down, the pleadings for this case. So I typed it. I drafted it by hand. The stenographers typed it all up as they did in those days, and showed him a draft. And he said, "Yep, that's fine. You can file the papers." So I felt very proud of myself. I went down to the district court, and of course the document got rejected because the paperclip was in the wrong place. So after that, I thought, okay, law is not for me. That's not really, practicing law is not for me. But Massey University offered me a job, and I'm very grateful to them. I started as a junior lecturer there and thoroughly enjoyed it. I had some great mentors, great teachers. So Ray Mulholland, John Lennart, the late John Lennart, the late Raymond Holland. They were fantastic teachers, and they taught me that it didn't really matter whether you covered all the material in detail when you were teaching. You didn't have to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. The students would work that stuff out for themselves. What mattered is that students enjoyed being there. They wanted to learn, right? And you got them interested, they would teach themselves that stuff. So that was a useful lesson that I learned early on, and very grateful to them. But of course, Massey was a bit of a dead end. I really found it very boring in Palmerston North. That's a picture of the square in Palmerston North. Still looks exactly the same today, it hasn't changed. And for a while, I mean, it looked very kind of Midwestern American kind of town, but she had grown up in a big city in Portland. And Palmerston North was quite stifling, and after a little while, I saw a job advertised at Auckland. So so then we ended up in Tamaki Makaurau. And my first job, I'm very grateful to the Department of Commercial Law. First I was offered a 3-year contract at the Tamaki campus, which sadly I see is now up for sale. Well, the university no longer owns it. Beautiful buildings. It felt like a university. There were brick and tile buildings. You felt you were at a proper institution, and we lived close by, so it was a very, very good campus to be based in. And I began my academic career there. During the 3 years, the department advertised a permanent position, what we call a tenured position, which I applied for and got, and I've been here ever since. So that's how it started. And around the time that I graduated with my Master of Laws, our son Darren was born. And unfortunately, we couldn't resist the temptation of getting the little teddy bear with the graduation outfit, the law, and dressing him in it. He was just the right size for that. and of course, you know, that probably had some effect, because inevitably he's followed into the law. And Darren is here with us tonight. Very grateful to you, Darren, for coming here from Tokyo. He's now a senior associate with the global law firm DLA Piper. And so he's followed, he's a specialist employment lawyer. Our daughter was born 3 years later, Caitlin. That's an early family portrait. And yeah, not the best picture of you, Caitlin, sorry about that. I told you, there was a disclaimer at the beginning. But Caitlin is one of our distinguished alumni. So she graduated with a Bachelor of Commerce from this university. She's a commercial law major student, and it was a bit of a shock suddenly for having her turn up in my class. I was teaching stage 1, I was teaching the first year commercial law at that time, and she wasn't the only one. It was a whole posse of her friends enrolled in the class at the same time, and they would sit in the front row and took turns to ask fire questions at me. So it was like the Inquisition. So you had to really be at the top of your game, but that was a challenge, but we surmounted that. Now they say it takes a village to raise a child. In fact, it takes a department, because she went on to major in commercial law, and many of you in the room here have taught Caitlin, right? She's done your subjects, and she tells me that it's benefited her in her career. She now works in a very successful career in HR software, and apply those skills that my colleagues taught her in interpreting contracts, understanding legislation, and so on. Okay, last year Caitlin got married to Andrew, who's from Wales. They live close to us, but they got married in the States. And Andrew is also here tonight. Andrew works in logistics. He works for one of New Zealand's largest forklift companies that imports forklifts. He does their logistics. So thanks, Andrew, for being here tonight. So that's my family, essentially. That's, yeah. All right, let's go back to the legal verse, because there better be some privacy in here, otherwise people will. So how did I get into privacy? So back to the story. So we're in Auckland. I'm now appointed as a fairly junior academic in the Department of Commercial Law. And I call it the legal verse. I don't know if there is such a word, but it sounds good, so I thought I'll put it in there. And so my head of department at the time, Ian Eagles, was a great mentor. He was our first head of department of commercial law. And he was a great mentor. He said, you've got to get going right away with your research. forget about all this teaching stuff. Teaching is boring. You know, no, but you're not going to get promoted on teaching. That's what it was like in those days. So he said, get going with your research. So I hit the ground running, and I got a few very good publications in these English journals, which were theoretical in focus. So I looked at what was the, as common lawyers, people here who are lawyers will know that lawyers tend to gravitate towards case law and precedent. And they say it's not real law unless there's precedent, and the courts have nitpicked on something. But I turned that around the other way, and I thought, well, what about all these statutes? Because I was political, right? I wanted to know about statutes. And statutes are more than just something that is political. Sometimes they have some deep theoretical base underneath the statute. And what if that theory can be used to actually develop the precedents that the courts make as well? So that was my premise, and it led to a string of articles. This is not all of them, this is just a handful of them, which ended up getting published in this reasonably good journal in the UK. And so that got me started. And my thesis, by the way, my master's thesis was on public law. So, so that's an inauspicious start to somebody who's in a commercial law department. But as it turns out, public law and sort of privacy are linked, because privacy ultimately is political, right? As we see, a lot of politics comes into privacy. So, so I'm glad I had that basis for looking at Parliament and how laws are made and so on. That was my master's thesis. But I got going with theory, and theory actually is helpful. As later on, it turns out that a lot of the stuff I've written, there's some philosophical theory underlying it, tying it all together. So that's where we got started with that. Now, how did privacy come in? Now, he's with us tonight. So Lech Janecki, who some of you will know, retired now, but he was a colleague at the Tamaki campus, lecturer in information systems at the time. And he came to my office one day and he said, hey, there's a thing called a Privacy Act. And I'm writing something on health information systems, and we want to know whether you can join with us to give us some analysis, legal analysis of privacy. And I said, well, I don't know anything about the Privacy Act, but I'll have a look into it for you. And that was how it started. And they were writing about healthcare information systems. Okay, so not much has changed. We're still grappling with some of these issues. How do you centralize health information? Because health information is all very useful if you have it stored in your doctor's office, but you need to share it. You need to be able to send or receive results from labs. You need to be able to, GPs need to be able to communicate with hospitals, with specialists. So the health information has to actually flow, otherwise, but New Zealand had this Privacy Act. It had an architecture for that. So anyway, that's how we got started. And I suddenly got fascinated by it. Okay, this is like technologically neutral law, principle-based law. Okay, I can write about this. And so that's how we got started. But initially, a lot of our publications were just in information systems journals. And of course, you can imagine that got me into trouble, because my head of department and others said, this is not serious law. You should concentrate on legal journals, and you're wasting your time. This is a sissy subject, don't do this. So anyway, there it was. But I persevered. Now, in the meantime, of course, we had to do the teaching. The bread and butter business of teaching had to go on during all this time. And I'm very proud of the fact that I managed to team up with many of my colleagues, including the former dean of this business school, who. The problem we had was that all the textbooks were for lawyers, right? And our students are not going to go into court and argue a case. They need to basically be able to spot a problem, identify a problem, know when to go and see a lawyer, but certainly they don't need to argue the finer points of the law. So we thought, well, we have to write our own books. Let's write our own textbooks, and we did. We wrote a string of them. And for decades, they were very useful. Our students picked up some useful skills. And so I'm very, very proud of that experiment. Now, teaching in those days, again, I had the philosophy that students had to have fun, because otherwise they're not going to learn. Now there are buzzwords like active learning and team-based learning and all that kind of stuff. But you know, decades before all of that, I kind of figured out, okay, you got to do some interesting stuff. So one of the things my colleagues know I like to do is role plays. And now this is, unfortunately, there's very few records of this, and I'm grateful to the student who did video this. But this is very old. I now have a much more fuller set of costumes and a wardrobe. I have a complete wardrobe. This was in the early days, but see what I don't know, you'll have to listen to it. The audio is a bit faint. Okay, you get the idea. So how else would you teach equity unless you kind of have a role play where you play it out? So students really had fun in those days, and I enjoyed it as well. Now, in the meantime, of course, there was, my boss was on my shoulder saying, no, stop this privacy stuff. You know, you're wasting your time. You need to do some proper commercial law. And now, luckily, thanks to Aruni, we used to have, my first 2 sabbaticals were in the US. So I spent 2 very nice summers based at the Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland. And obviously free accommodation within laws, right? So it's a no-brainer. Now, where else do you go for your sabbatical? So I went to the States. And while I was in the States, I was very intrigued by the fact that they had a lot of law governing franchises. And we had 0 law in New Zealand governing franchises. So and people were telling me back in New Zealand, well, what are we going to do about protecting franchisees? And there were a lot of franchisees who were losing their money. So people were saying, well, you know, we can look to the US and other countries. So I thought this is something to research. So I started researching, and that became a long road and a long struggle to try and get some protection for franchisees, people who buy franchises. There was many stories of people who had lost their money, who have been sold a lemon, essentially. They've been told to buy a franchise on the basis that it works. It's a great model, but of course it's a green fields. It works in other countries, but in that territory, it doesn't take off. So they go to court and they're not successful. So this battle started with a bang. The first salvo in this war was fired around 2008, 2009. One of my colleagues, she's here tonight, she's a senior lecturer in the department. At the time, she was a researcher in the department, so I co-published with her. We looked at franchising and misleading and deceptive conduct. And an empirical study found that far bigger percentage of misleading and deceptive claims involved the franchising sector than any other sector, even though franchising at that time was quite small in New Zealand. So we empirically proved that. At the same time, our media team went to work, put out a media release, and then I ended up on TV. This is one of my first TV appearances. It was terrible. I was nervous like hell. I was blinking. It was a cringeworthy interview, right? So not one I'm proud of, but I had decided to make one statement during it that franchising was a wild west in New Zealand. Now that got picked up. And it got picked up and quoted in Parliament. People then read the report that we had published, the business school report. Both the opposition and the minister read the report, and they both quoted from it, right? So it's in Hansard. So that was a big win. Same month, we had a symposium, a conference here, where we brought, for the very first time, we brought franchise experts from around the world and New Zealand to the business school. It was the first legal symposium held in New Zealand. Unfortunately, the national government at the time decided the week beforehand that it had decided not to regulate franchising. So the Herald interviewed me, and I told the Herald that this was disappointing, that I'd wish that the minister would, the minister was going to be the keynote speaker. Said I preferred if the minister made his decision after he heard what experts had to say. Now this is how the Herald reported it the next day, front page of the Herald. And then they went on to say, Commerce Minister Simon Power is likely to face a roasting from franchise law experts. Now, that morning, he arrived down outside this building, and I went down to greet him. And so I shook hands with him and said, Minister, I'm afraid I'm the one doing the roasting. And I don't think he saw the funny side of it. So I learned some valuable lessons that day about what you say to the media. You've got to be careful. Yeah. So anyway, that was an early, but in the end, we were successful. This was a big collaborative effort. Many students and colleagues and others collaborated with me with this research. The government said we can have the existing regulatory framework. We can maybe modify that to deal with franchising. Well, blow me down. One of my, Lorna Fussy, wrote an honours dissertation. She's here tonight. I'm very grateful to you for coming. You have no idea, Lorna, how influential that article was. Okay, that was exactly at the right time. It's what the government needed to hear. We can tweak the existing law to make some changes. And what's in that paper, word for word, is what's in Section 5. Is it Section 5C? I always forget what it is. It's in the Fair Trading Act. Let's see if I can. Yeah, Section 5C and Section 5D of the Fair Trading Act, and Section 12A to 12D, unsubstantiated representations. And yeah, so they accepted that. And there was some skullduggery as well. It wouldn't be New Zealand if there wasn't some skullduggery. I discovered that the minister's chief legal advisor was my classmate at law school. And so that's how things work, right? So the minister to this day has no idea where that came from. But yeah, so it led to a change in the law, a real change in the law. So that's great. And so little things like that. Of course, New Zealand also adopted unfair contract terms in the Fair Trading Act. That wasn't our work. We can't take credit for that. Other people were involved with that. But all of those things collectively helped to level the playing field. And I think franchisees today have a lot better degree of protection than they did back then. Okay, back to privacy. So we were doing the mahi, we were doing the real, the real grind of finding out what are privacy, what are people worried about when it comes to their privacy. And again, the work of a large number of very distinguished summer scholars. I had a string of very talented young summer scholars who did the digging out of these statistics to find out. New Zealand was unusual, right? It had over 100, several hundred cases that were brought in the specialist court, the tribunal that rules on privacy cases. Unlike other countries, New Zealand had a complaints-based system, and people were suing. And what were they suing about? Who was suing? What were the causes of these disputes? What kind of remedies were they getting? So we mined all of this qualitative data, and it led to statistics. And yeah, and then you can generate statistics. So I have essentially from 1994 mined that data. And this is just the last 10 years. If you look at from 2015 and 2025, if you know about, the Privacy Act has principles, right? Collection principles, access rights, rules about disclosure. Straight away, you can see what the problem is, right? From those statistics. People are not getting access to their information when they're asking for it. Also, they're far more successful in asking for that. A lot of the claims are unsuccessful. You can see the unsuccessful ones are in purple. Also, disclosure is litigated more now in New Zealand. So these statistics are useful. It tells you at a glance what people are suing for. We have a system in New Zealand where the Privacy Commissioner is meant to give people access when they should have access to their data. But sadly, the Commissioner is missing in action because people are having to sue and they're succeeding. But they shouldn't have to do that. The Commissioner should be able to make the rulings that he has now power to do under the 2020 Act. The other really interesting thing we found is we looked at why, what's the context of these disputes? So is it a privacy matter, or was there some other dispute between the parties that was there at the same time that led to the privacy issue being litigated? And we found, blow me down, so at the current, for the last 10 years, 66% of these cases had something to do with something other than privacy. Employment law dispute, maybe it's a dispute with an insurance company or something like that, and then it drags in privacy. So that was interesting too. That gave us a different perspective. Okay, a watershed moment was reached in 2007. Nowadays we call this data sovereignty. And data sovereignty is not the same thing as Māori data sovereignty. That's a slice of it. That's one part of it. Data sovereignty is a much bigger topic. But I first got into this in 2007. So 2007, privacy is always an issue with information going between borders. And I submitted a draft of this article to one of my colleagues. And she said, it's a good article. I wanted to get some feedback on my manuscript. She said, it's a good article, but your opening line needs to be improved. So I sat back, okay, well, how can I make my opening line better? So I wrote this: blood running through the veins of 21st century commerce will increasingly consist of information about individuals. Well, that article went viral. Okay, it got picked up by privacy authorities around the world. The federal German commissioner quoted that line in her opening report, in the opening sentence of her report to the federal German parliament. So that article then got me going with this, and there's been a string of articles on the topic of data sovereignty. The most recent one is whether there is such a thing as data sovereignty given the cloud services and the platforms we now have. So once we got into this, then we just have to ride the wave, right? So Alan Toy is a collaborator, a colleague. Initially he was at Otago University before joining this institution. We started researching, by the way, I mentioned one of the earlier articles was written with Erin Dillon. Erin was my first summer scholar, 2008, and she also got me to join Facebook. Erin was my first Facebook friend. I think Alan Toy was my second Facebook friend. But we decided that we would research social media and privacy. No one else had thought of doing that. So again, riding the wave, right? So Alan and I got some good publications in on that. And then we wrote a seminal piece, Principles or Rules. Is this really about rules, or are there some deeper principles under these? So going back to that theoretical base, which I had started off, and that sustained us. It's like the engine of our productivity, I guess. And Alan and I are working on a theoretical piece at the moment. Okay, so there's a whole string of them. Another turning point was 2016. Sadly, Jingy's not able to be here tonight, but so this is another brilliant young summer scholar. And we started researching how the Americans had, with the Federal Trade Commission, brought claims against these big platforms, Facebook as it then was, Snapchat, and all these other companies. Now, believe it or not, I didn't even have a smartphone at that point. And so Jingy was very frustrated because she had to show me on her phone how some of these things work. But this was written in 2015, just as the Cambridge Analytica stuff was going on in the UK. Now, we didn't know that was going on at the time, but this article essentially outed those practices. So we could see these, and I began to realize that these platforms are all interconnected. And all the apps, every time you get an app, it will feed data to, and our colleague Fernando here at the business school has done some very good recent research on that. But it's just like a sieve, it leaks, the data goes everywhere. They're not selling your data, they're essentially providing a conduit where the data is accessed by everybody else. So that was Jingy. We worked on this project, and so that was another very, very good article. Employment law and privacy started going multidisciplinary. Privacy has always been multidisciplinary, starting with LEC back in the early 1990s. But now it's even more interdisciplinary. The accounting profession gets into it. In 2019, in April 2019, exactly 1 month after the Christchurch mosque massacre, I got an invite from Facebook. All expenses paid, 1 week trip to Menlo Park. I was criticized by people who said they would never talk to me again. But I took the gamble. I thought, okay, I'm going to go into the heart of the beast and see what this is about. It was a PR stunt. They wanted somebody from New Zealand to attend their annual privacy summit. And this is a picture taken inside Menlo Park, inside their headquarters. It's an illegal picture because they don't allow photography inside their campus. But my friend I had a friend who works for Facebook at the time, and so she took it with her phone. It's a weird place. It's like going into the Vatican. It's like going into another country. You got to surrender your passport when you go in there, and you realize that the staff who work there, they get all 3 meals provided: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There are sleeping pods. Some of them never leave the premises, right? It's kind of scary. But I got to interact one-on-one with Facebook's chief privacy officer, Erin Egan. I think she still is the CPO. One-on-one time with her. But it was a PR stunt, but you get to find out how they think. And so I learned again a lot about it. And it was scary. You suddenly realize it's like talking to people who are another government. They almost had like departments of state within Facebook, children's division, something else division, gaming division. So these are like ministries. And later that year, I also visited the Microsoft campus, 40,000 people in Seattle, Redmond. Again, same thing. You get the feeling that you are dealing with a government, a sovereign government. That's the power of these platforms. Okay, we're getting close to the end now. I'm just conscious of the time. So in the meantime, of course, I was not the only one doing privacy. I realized one person on their own can't do much. But there were many others who, by this stage, were mobilized to fight this war. And academically, there is a grouping called the Asian Privacy Scholars Network. Many of my colleagues belong to that now. I was one of the original members of it, the APSN. And in 2016, we hosted their 5th international conference. So about 80 people came to Auckland. Now there are hundreds of people in this organization. It's a very big outfit. Around this time, we also launched, Dame Marie Schroff was New Zealand's 2nd privacy commissioner. Again, sadly, she can't be with us tonight. She's overseas at the moment. But when she stepped down as privacy commissioner, she and I had a chat. And we thought, well, what New Zealand is lacking is a civil society group that can advocate quite apart from the office of the privacy commissioner, because the office is limited in what it can do. But we need a not-for-profit organization. So we went through the motions, and we started Privacy Foundation New Zealand. That's our logo. It's a not-for-profit organization. So you can, if you're interested in privacy, feel free to join it. It's a very good organization. It lobbies the government. In 2017, just after the Jacinda Ardern government was elected, Maria and I visited the then Justice Minister. So this is real lobbying, right? This is inside the beehive, inside the Minister of Justice's office. Another old classmate of mine, okay, from law school. But he's a man of his word. He said he would pass the Privacy Act by the end of the year, and he did. So we put real pressure on them to do that. So again, the power of lobbying for the not-for-profit Privacy Foundation. And we advocated very strongly, and they decided, this is something we can do. So coming to the conclusion then, who owns our data? We live in a world where the data is, everything we do leaves a trail, and it's all scraped and taken. But one of the problems we face is the terms and conditions, right? If you look at, we just click I accept because you have no choice. But the terms are saying that essentially they can do anything they want with the data. aggregate it, de-identify it, so it's no longer your data. So they say that gives them the excuse to basically then do whatever they want with it. The other model is to say you're granting them a perpetual, irrevocable, sub-licensable, exclusive worldwide license to use your data for any purpose they want or to improve their service. So this is the kind of world we face. Tiffany's here tonight, I think. One of the things, again, now we have the Master of Information Governance program here. Very proud of that program. Many of my colleagues have been involved with developing it. It's one of our kind of glittering kind of treasures, a taonga. And the program is producing papers. So the students are writing research papers. And Tiffany, this was Tiffany's paper. She looked at grocery data in New Zealand. Who owns that? People wonder about why we don't have competition in the grocery sector in New Zealand. Well, the real reason no one's talking about is that there's only two lots of people who own all the data, right? So it's no point having more people buying the rental premises or whatever. These guys know all our shopping habits going back for 20 years. So there was a example given, well, one example is the famous Target commercial, right, where a father found out that his daughter was pregnant because of the marketing that was being offered. The store knew from the pattern of purchases that the daughter was pregnant. Okay, there was a sequential kind of pattern. She was buying unscented lotions. She was buying vitamin supplements. Those things could only mean that this person is pregnant. So then that's one famous example. The other one is the empty nesters example. So in Australia, there was an example of they could track your grocery expenditure for 20 years. They knew everything, exactly how much you had spent over 20 years. And they could track when suddenly there was a drop in the amount of grocery expenditure. At the same time, there's an increase in the amount that those people are spending on entertainment. That could only mean the kids have left the home, right? Empty nesters. So let's target them for real estate. And the real estate people were told, don't say where you got the idea to contact them. So they knew this was fishy. This is the kind of thing that was going on. So how do we deal with that? How do we, it's very difficult because you could say it was not personal information, it's just some attribute of the person. So that led me to think, what about of all those people who share those attributes? So, newly pregnant mothers, empty nesters, people who have a common interest because their kids have left the home. How about, why can't they combine their data for their own purposes? Not so that they're objects that can be targeted, but that they can actually harvest that data and use it as leverage, right? And that led me to thinking about whether legal personality is something we can have. So we're not saying that somebody owns your data. We're saying let the data own itself. And right in the Tawa Tupua, my hometown, there is an example of that. The Whanganui River owns itself. It is a legal entity, a separate legal entity by law. And people have rights and interests over it. So nobody can say they own the river. It owns itself. So if a river can own itself, why can't data own itself? And maybe stewards are appointed to be custodians of it. So that's where my research is going. That's where the future is. And there's a forthcoming chapter in that. But that's essentially, so this journey has only still started. It's got a long way to go. And I think we need to think about how the law can solve all these problems. But I want to end by saying that a lot of the privacy scholars around the world that I admire greatly, Daniel Solov, and people like Shoshana Zuboff, you might have heard about her, surveillance capitalism, they all say the same thing, that the law can tackle these problems. We can't say it's all too difficult. Technology has gone too far. The law has solutions to all these problems. If, we see the UK now starting to act to say, if something is unsafe, if a platform is unsafe and children are at peril, then the state can regulate that. It's like saying you regulate firearms, you regulate cars. We no longer have cars that blow up when when somebody rear ends the car. That's a matter of standards, right? The state can regulate that. And then the counter argument is, oh, but Facebook is too big. It's a big platform. It dominates everything. Well, we have competition law. We can break them up, right? We have monopolies. We've done that in the past. So I think what we need is the political will. So coming back to the politics of privacy, I think we need to put pressure on our politicians to do something. So I'm going to end on that note. Sorry, I've gone a little bit longer than I had intended, but thank you very much for that. And yeah, I want to thank everyone again for coming. It's been a great party to celebrate with you guys. All right, thank you.